so if this works, we should be able to do this. I'm going to just, for a second.
Test.
Hey, I did something right. Sorry. No. Me and technology this week have not had a very good relationship, and so So for me to actually get something right with technology right now is an accomplishment, I should say. Okay, so the reason why I say that is because of this little tidbit. We have been trying to live stream our Wednesday night Bible classes over the last few weeks, and since we've started them back up. If you have questions, I still want you to ask questions. We still want you to ask questions and make comments, whatever the case may be. However, it's going to be a little bit different this time. Because on the live stream, they cannot hear the question being asked. So, here's a microphone. You know what a microphone is? You talk into it, it makes sound. It will make sound for them. It will amplify you in here, and you might not like to hear yourself talk, but I would like for you to be able to do this. That way they can hear you on the live stream. That way I'm not having to repeat the question. And also for those who have a question, and someone over here, say Butch can't hear Cindy ask a question or whatever, vice versa, then this will amplify your voice to where we don't have that problem anymore. Sound good to everybody? It's a test run this week because this is the first time we've actually tried to do this live. Those of you watching by YouTube right now, this is the first time we've actually tried doing this. So if it does not work, blame the operator, I guess. I don't know. Just hopefully it works. But anyway, we are in the final push before we actually get to the independent restoration movements that started in America in the mid to late 1700s. We are in the home stretch before we start talking about the things that are pertinent to the church history that we all have probably grown up hearing over the years. However, we are going to also add some detail that you might not have ever heard before. And I am going to definitely try to make this as interesting as possible. Because sometimes you can get bogged down into the weeds of the different names and the different situations and the different histories and things of that nature. I do want to add one little caveat to something that we talked about a couple of weeks back. I mentioned the name William Tyndale. You may remember me mentioning that name. He is one of the first authors of one of the first English Bibles that was ever produced, the Tyndale version. There has been new evidence, and when I say new, over the last few months, over the last year, there has been new evidence that has come to light in some of his writings that have been uncovered that suggests that he actually might have been closer to the New Testament church than we originally thought. That he actually might have been a restorationist and not a reformationist. He might have been a man who was actually a precursor to Alexander Campbell and Barton W. Stone and Raccoon John Smith. that he actually had some influence on these men, uh, and that some history that we knew about William Tyndall might actually be kind of skewed because of Reformation history and things of that nature. But that's another story for another day. We don't have a lot of time to go through all of that, so we're not going to take the time to do this. We had talked about, and I'm going to back up one slide. We had talked about last week, 2 weeks ago, not last week. Last week was the oddball week where myself and Cameron did our quick lesson in 30 minutes. But we were talking about John Glass and the Glassite churches in Scotland. And we had mentioned that he had been buried in Howth. John Glass had, and that this is where his tomb is located. His burial site is located. His tombstone, that is Scott Harp. If you want to know more information than you care to know about the Restoration movement, ask that man right there, Scott Harp. He is the co-founder of the RestorationMovement.com. He goes all over the world and does Restoration Movement history, and he does a lot of discovery evidence. He unearths different things. He has in his library first editions of some works from Alexander Campbell, from Raccoon John Smith, and others from the 1800s, and even some men from the 1700s and before. He has been able to go to different places and see different things, and that's the reason why a lot of this is in existence, is he's done a lot of that research. And so he's done a lot of stuff. I have a book that he just produced called The Sage of Jasper, and it's the first full biography of Gus Nichols. You may know that name. Gus Nichols was a minister for many, many years. Had influence in this area, in the state of Tennessee, and especially in Alabama, around Jasper. Hence the name of the book, The Sage of Jasper. And he was a very influential man, baptized in what we believe could be upwards of 25 to 35,000 people in his lifetime. That is an amazing, amazing accomplishment, thinking about how many people were touched by the gospel, by him just proclaiming it in such a way that he did. But John Glass is buried in Howth, Scotland, getting back to our lesson. And then we're going to talk about this man, Robert Sandeman, 1718 to 1771. He was a gentleman who was born in April. We're not going to spend a lot of time. His father was a magistrate in Perth. He is a gentleman who, there we go. He attended Edinburgh and was preparing to be in the Church of Scotland in 1734. He was preparing to be one of the guys that was going to be part of the Church of Scotland. He became acquainted with John Glass throughout his youth. By 1735, remember, he was preparing for ministry in the Church of Scotland. In 1734, 1 year later, he gives this up. He gives up the idea of even wanting to become a minister, and he goes into weaving. He wants to have nothing to do with ministry. He wants to do nothing of the sort. And I can relate to him in some aspects. There have been times through the first couple of years of my ministry where I was very close to quitting because it's a very tough time to be a minister, and it's very tough. It's very difficult, especially the long nights, the sleepless nights. There are times where you do not go to sleep. You are sitting up, restless, sitting up, not sure what to do, not sure what to say. And so he just gave it up and went into weaving. He married Catherine Gloss in 1737. They started dating. He started courting her in 1736. He marries her in 1737, the daughter of John. He sets up his weaving business in 1740, and in 1756, his brother marries another one of John Gloss's daughters, and so they just become one big old happy family. By this point in time, in 1756, but Robert Sandeman had yet to go into some kind of ministry. He still was trying to stay away from ministry in those respects. Well, then we fast forward, and we get to, if this will work. Well, there we go. 1744. We back up a little bit. Age 26, he becomes an elder at the Perth Congregational Church. And we'll talk about some things connected to this here in just a minute. He preached for 16 years. He was in his weaving business for 3.5, 4 years, and then he gets out, and John Gloss talks him into being a preacher. And he's a preacher in Perth, Dundee, and Edinburgh for 16 years. In 1757, he would write two books actually, called The Letters of Theron and Apazio, and he would deny and completely go against Calvinism, which was rampant in this part of Scotland. We've talked about Calvinism, the tulip, total depravity, unlimited atonement, unlimited, oh goodness. The tulip, I cannot remember, unlimited grace. Anyway, Calvin's tulip. And he teaches in this 2-volume work, Letters on Theron and Apazio, against Calvinism. He goes strictly against it. And this is because Theron and Apazio was put out in 1755 by James Harvey, and he is very apologetic to Calvinism. He says that Calvin is one of the greatest theologians because he knows how to interpret the Bible. He knows his Bible. And Sandeman says, no, he doesn't, because if he did, then he would know that Scripture does not teach what he teaches. And so in the Letters of Theron and Apazio, he denies this. As a result, more congregational churches began appearing. We've talked about congregational churches over the course of this study, and they began appearing throughout London and throughout England. He and his brother went to London to teach these ideas that he had, and the Church of London, the Church of Scotland did not like it. They did not like it whatsoever, and there were a lot of people that did not like the fact that they were teaching against Calvinism. They were teaching against one person above the whole church, that every church was autonomous, and that Lord's Supper should be taken each Lord's Day. They were doing a lot of things that the churches did not like in both of those countries. And by 1766, you find more churches popping up all over London. This is a picture outside of Edinburgh, Scotland, of the Glossite church. It is the last Glossite church. It was because John Gloss in his own studies was very close to what we find in the New Testament. This would be one of the churches that would be established. The church would read, the church sign, which is still in existence, says meeting house for Church of Christ for public worship. It gives the prayer times and gives what they do each day of the week. And then on the Wednesday night, weeknight meetings, they met at 7:10. All are welcome. And notice that it was a Church of Christ for public worship. This church is not in existence anymore. It shut its doors in, I believe, 2010. It is now, this is what it looked like, but it is now a movie theater. The pews still are in existence, but the Glossite church that met in Edinburgh is no longer in existence. And that sign still is in existence. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, it is in storage there, and there are several people who are actually trying to get it moved to the United States to restore it and to preserve it and put it at one of our colleges. That is what I understood from someone who told me about it. But that is very interesting that this church does not exist anymore. Just goes to show you that even a strong church can die. Even churches can die. So we've got to be very careful in how we do this. Some more information about Robert Sandeman. He would go to America, and he would have some influence in America. We talked about his letters of Theron and Apazio. Well, they are sent on boats to the colonies, and they would start being widely spread. In 1763, he receives a letter urging him to come to America. He would go to America, and he would arrive in Boston Harbor in 1764. He would start establishing churches all over Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, and other New England states. There were Glossite churches all over New England in the late 1700s, before Thomas and Alexander Campbell would come into the Americas. Sandeman died in Danbury, Connecticut, 2 years before Gloss would in Scotland. Now, here's some interesting facts about the Glossites and the Sandemanians. They wanted to reenact first century order in Christianity. They denied the tenets of Calvinism. They had Lord's Supper every Sunday. They observed love feasts, which you find in Scripture. They believe that you come together and eat together, because that is what you need to do, is have fellowship with one another. Build up the church in love. They did do something that was odd, which is foot washings. They did believe in foot washings. I'm sorry, folks, I ain't washing your feet. What? Ricky? He needs the mic. He wants you to use the microphone so you can actually.
I said, brother, what if I get down and I can't wash my feet?
That's a different scenario.
You just said, Butch, you ain't gonna wash nobody's feet.
I wash my wife's feet.
But we're supposed to be servants. Huh?
I see what you're saying. Yeah, exactly. We'll use a pressure washer.
But my point is,
Mm-hmm. Here, actually, for the live stream, that way. Yeah, that way they can actually hear you.
my point was that we are to be servants.
Yes.
Of course, we laughed about it. But if it did come a case,
Yes.
and I believe you would do this too.
Yes.
If we had to, we would wash our brother and sister's feet.
Absolutely.
Our body.
Absolutely.
I've been in that position too. So, of course, like I said, I don't think you meant it the way it came out.
Yeah.
You understand me?
I completely understand, and that's the reason why. Before we get the microphone, that's the reason why I completely agree with the notion that we need to re-examine James chapter 5 and re-examine the servant's heart of James chapter 5 and the servant's heart of Jesus when he does go and wash the feet of his disciples. Because we can say all day long we're servants serving others. But there's a difference in saying it and there's a difference in action.
Sure.
And I think and correct me if I'm wrong, I think for several years we have been afraid to talk about being a servant and being a servant in that sense because it's either demeaning or we think it's demeaning in our culture that we get down and we're washing feet. We're serving someone who doesn't have as much as we do or doesn't have the right. No, we serve each other. It doesn't matter who we are. It doesn't matter what our purpose is. And I think that's what the Colossites and the Sandemanians were doing, was that they were taking James 5 and the situation with Jesus, they were taking it seriously.
And I would have to say also on the other hand, if that's the worst thing that we ever had to do, and believe you me, I've done worse, that ain't nothing to fuss about.
No, it is nothing to fuss about. I think Pat had a comment. You don't want the microphone? Okay.
All I have to say is, this is not the day to kind of walk. Back then it was necessary because they were dirt, walking in sandals, and no shoes. It's not like that it was. But
Right.
our serving someone, we need to go all the way, whatever it takes, or at least do it.
If you are going to be a servant, and if you're going to be someone who serves others, you're going to, whether it be figuratively or literally, you are going to be washing other people's feet. Whether it be figuratively or literally, you're going to be washing other people's feet because you are going to serve in whatever capacity, as you pointed out, Ricky. You're going to serve in whatever capacity you are needed, and we've got it to do. And I think that the Colossites and the Sandemanians were onto something.
Well, now, I don't want to be on live stream on this.
Okay.
I have to draw the line in the heart.
You can just feel the love in here. Anyway, there was another thing that the Glossites and the Sandemanians had, which is that they had mutual exhortations. They exhorted each other. They exhorted one another. And that's something, again, that is very difficult to think about. Well, that person said something wrong against me last week. How am I supposed to exhort them? You do it anyway. Well, that person said something about X and X. You exhort them still. Doesn't matter who you are. Doesn't matter what you do. Doesn't matter what that person does. You exhort. We are to reprove, rebuke, and exhort. Let me say that again so we actually have everybody say it. Reprove, rebuke, and exhort with all patience and teaching. We have patience, we teach, and we exhort one another as we see the day approaching. Now, sometimes we forget about that, don't we? Sometimes we want to do the reproving, and we want to do the rebuking, but when it comes to the exhorting, we can't exhort. We can't exhort. We can't speak to one another in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs. We can't tell people about the good news of the gospel of Christ because that person I can't do it. We got to do it. They also believed in casting lots, which was odd. They believed in casting lots in certain aspects. So they did have some things that were odd about them, but they did have some beliefs that we can trace back to what the Bible says. And so you see that, yes, ma'am. Uh-huh.
Well, traditionally, was casting lots not something that someone would do in order to have to do something?
Yes, and that's, yeah.
The point I'm trying to make is instead of certain people always doing the things that no one else wanted to do, could they have not casted lots so that way everybody had to participate in the service?
I think that's what they meant by that. I have not gone full detailed as to what they meant when they casted lots, but I would have to assume that they probably used that in some kind of system like that, or whatever. I just don't know. But it was something that was odd to them. They did that because they read and they followed. They said that, well, it happened. They pulled out certain scriptures and said, well, it happened in Scripture, so it has to be done. Well, it's gray area. There's some things that they did that we just don't understand why they did them in the way they did them. But Robert Sandeman would die in Connecticut on April 2nd, 1771. As we have pointed out, he would be buried in Danbury, Connecticut. And there is a place where you can see some of the things from some of those early Connecticut churches in Danbury. If you go up there, there are some things. Yes, sir.
Was this church called the Church of Christ?
Here, I don't think so. Sandeman was more of the congregational church mindset. He was very much in the congregational church mindset. Um, Gloss, John Gloss was more of the let's go. He was wanting to go back to this. He didn't go back to the Bible for everything. He still had some. He had some ideas that were not of the Bible, but Gloss at least was willing to go back all the way. Sandeman still had some issues, and I think, if I'm not mistaken, the churches that he established in Connecticut and other places were more of the congregational church aspect that he came from in Scotland and London. He would bring those over here and do the congregational church aspect of it. But yeah, Gloss, yes. Sandeman, I want to say not sure.
What was the name of her church?
Congregational church. It was such and such congregational church. Like Edinburgh, when he was in Edinburgh just before he and his brother William went over to London, they established the Edinburgh Congregational Church. And so when he went over to London, he would establish different churches in the little different shires that were around London at the time. And they would be, there's one, Lorchestershire, where you could see Lorchestershire Congregational Church or whatever the case may be. And so when he went to Danbury, he did the same thing. He would just go to these little towns and set up little congregational churches. But John Gloss, on the other hand, a lot of the Glossite churches were very much more trying to go back to the New Testament for everything. They didn't go back to it for everything. They tried, and they were more restorationists than the congregational churches were, if that makes sense. So Sandeman did this. Robert and James Haldane would come in 1798. James was born in 1768. He would die in 1851. He would start a church in England after the order of Gloss and Sandeman. He would start a church called the Tabernacle Church with 310 people in 1799. They administered the Lord's Supper every Sunday. They took up weekly collections. They operated schools throughout England. They were close associate to Greville Ewing, and we'll talk a little bit more about Greville Ewing in some studies soon. And he associated himself with the Baptists. But he would then leave. The Haldanes would leave the Baptists, and there's where the church, the home was of Robert and James, Airthray Castle in Stirling, Scotland. And there's a closer picture of his home. And there is another picture, some pictures from the inside. There's you some interesting little snapshots of what it looked like. The teachings at the Tabernacle Church. New Testament contained the pattern for all Christian service. They believed that the New Testament was the pattern. Apostolic church model provided church model for all ages. So they went to that, thus teaching restoration or restitution. They would say that the churches needed to restore the apostolic church model, and go back to congregational autonomy. That there was no set group of men over one particular. There was no set group of people who would be voted on, or one set man like a pope that would be put in or installed over a set number of churches. That every church was autonomous to each other. Elders would serve in each congregation, teaching and ruling over that one congregation. Each church had its own deacons and minister. And civil authorities had no right in church matters, which was different than what you'd seen in churches such as the Catholic Church and others, where civil authorities had a lot to say in church matters. If there was a dispute, the civil authorities were brought in before anyone else, and they said, no, that's not the case. We're going to take it up with each other and take it up in our own congregation. Weekly observance of the Lord's Supper, we've already talked about that. By 1808, both Robert and James Haldane believed that immersion was the only proper mode of baptism. The Haldanes differed with Gloss over discipline, took a more loving approach to church discipline. Said we need to love the person who might do something that is publicly wrong and needs to be corrected, and they took a more loving approach, going to them first and doing that instead of just excommunicating them on the spot. So they tried. As you've probably noticed, a lot of these churches tried. A lot of these men tried. But they still were not really willing to go all the way. There was a lot of things that were being said, a lot of things being done, but there were still things that needed to be taken care of and were not taken care of. Right now, the Haldane Tabernacle, or where it was located in Edinburgh, is now a playhouse. Glosside Church is a movie theater. Haldane Tabernacle was turned into a playhouse. But that's where it's located, is right there on a thoroughfare, right there in Edinburgh, Scotland. We said something about Greville Ewing. I want to try to get through this because I want to talk about something that will take us into what we're going to be talking about next week. So Greville Ewing was born in Scotland. He supported mission and congregationalism in Scotland, and he was a founding member and secretary of Edinburgh Missionary Society in 1796. We will talk about the Missionary Society and how the fact that the Missionary Society actually split the Churches of Christ and the Christian churches in the late 1800s right here in the United States over the Missionary Society issue. The influence of Greville Ewing, well, he would meet and work with the Haldane brothers until 1808. He would be preaching and teaching in schools from 1800 to 1839. He was a minister of Mother Church of Scottish Congregationalism, Glasgow, Scotland. He instructed at the University of Glasgow. And why is that significant? Because he would be a teacher when Alexander Campbell would walk through the halls of the University of Glasgow. At the University of Glasgow was where Alexander Campbell would receive word that his father, who had left a couple of years before, had made it to the United States, and that he had left Presbyterianism, and he had left these different things, and he would leave Congregationalism, leave Presbyterianism, leave all of these man-made religions, and go into what we find today in his history when he came to the United States. But he had Greville Ewing as a teacher in 1808 and 1809, just before he left the University of Glasgow. Why is this all important? Why did we talk about the Reformation? Why did we talk about stuff from 300 all the way up till 1785 or something? Well, there are some causes for this. M.M. Davis would write in his book, How the Disciples Began and Grow, 7 significant things that were at work in religion that brought about the Restoration movement that happened in North America. Movement of transition from medieval to modern world, especially classical arts and letters. Earliest traces to 14th century Italy. Within 100 years, this is the Renaissance, you find all these things. 2 fundamental principles going down. The right of private judgment, the Bible when studied would produce unity among Christians as it did in the first century. That was his point. That was M.M. Davis's point, was that if the Bible was studied by the common man and not by the preacher and not by the pastor and not by the people who were in leadership, that if it was studied, it would produce unity among Christians as it did in the first century. That was what he believed. So you go in and you find that, well, there was a divided church. If you go over to John chapter 17, verses 11 through 23, you find that Christ prays in the high priestly prayer. That is the actual Lord's Prayer, not Matthew chapter 6. Matthew 6 is the model prayer. The prayer in John 17 is the Lord's Prayer. That is the high priestly prayer. That is the one where he prays for unity. And in light of Jesus' teaching, unity was not only possible, but commanded. Other passages promoting unity, if you go over to John 10:16, Romans 1 verse 10, chapter 3 verse 3, chapter 12 verses 12 through 27, you find unity being promoted and commanded by God and through the Holy Spirit who breathed out the words of this book. Churches in their day were far from will or disposition to promote unity. And so you find that divisions existed and it weakened the forces of God. Instead of one force for God, there were many small detachments, jealously watching each other rather than the common foe. And so you find that there was a warring church. And we have already discussed that the Church of Rome swooped in. There were councils all throughout the first few centuries after the first century that would become very decisive in dividing the church and trying to become the one church over many. And they started devouring each other. Protestant churches, as they became known as in the mid 1500s, were physical enemies. Public displays of rhetorical hatred was spouted forth. Physical engagements and wars often resulted. And we find in Matthew chapter 12, verse 25 and 26, a house divided against itself cannot stand. And so, when all the chips were down, when things were going, when you even look at the church and the religious situation in North America in the mid-1700s to late 1700s, you find that there were different things that were happening. There was blind leading the blind. Bible was not understood as systematic revelation, but jumble of jewels. They were seen as equally applicable between Moses and Jesus. Man was a machine, and conversion was seen as a miracle. You had arrogant people in the clergy and in the ministerial groups, and so you get human creeds. Creedalism ruled with the rod of iron. We're trying to get through this because I want us to be able to get to the good stuff next week. The Bible was a neglected treasure. Creeds destroyed unity because each one claimed to be the right creed, claimed to be inspired, claimed to be right on par to this book. And so creeds were being thrown around as the prevailing thought. There was infidelity. The world was getting darker and darker. You had churches, you had universities popping up all over the United States, all over North America that promoted liberal theology, promoted this idea and these different ideas that went against what the Bible discussed. And so we find that in that arose some people who were tired of the warring. They were tired of the division. They were tired of man becoming pretty much its own God and saying what God was going to do for them and what God was going to do for the church. They decided they were going to restore the New Testament order in the United States. And that's what they did. And we continue to take up the mantle that they do today. And so we will get into the independent restoration movements next week. If you have any questions, please see me after. Or if you have any questions, save them for next week and we'll get into those next week.
Good evening. I will lift my eyes into the darkest night, for I know my Savior lives. These are some of the lines from the song, How Can I Keep From Singing? If you turn to Genesis chapter 1, we're going to look at some verses there. Verses 3 and 4, it says, And God said, Let there be light, and there was light. And God saw the light was good, and God separated the light from the darkness. Verses 9 and 10. And God said, Let the waters under heavens be gathered together in one place, and let the dry land appear, and it was so. God called the dry land earth, and the waters that were gathered together he called seas, and God saw that it was good. Verses 11 and 12. And God said, Let the earth sprout vegetation, plants, yielding seeds, and fruit trees, bearing fruit in which is their seed, each according to its kind on the earth. And it was so. The earth brought forth vegetation, plants yielding seed according to their own kind, and trees bearing fruit in which their seed, each according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. Verses 16 through 18. And God made the two great lights, the greater light to rule the day, and the lesser light to rule the night, and the stars. And God set them in the expanse of the heavens to give light on earth, to rule over the day, and over the night, and to separate the light from the darkness. And God saw that it was good. Verses 21. So God created the great sea creatures and every living creature that moves, with which the waters swarm, according to their kind, and every winged bird according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. Verses 25. And God made the beasts of the earth according to their kind, and livestock according to their kinds, and everything that creeps on the ground according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. Verses 30 and 31. And to every beast of the earth, and to every bird of the heavens, and to everything that creeps on the earth, everything that has the bread of life, I have given every green plant for food. And it was so. And God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the sixth day. At God's Street last fall, we were playing capture flag. I wasn't moving. I was sitting in the back of a pickup truck on this butte farm, and I looked out onto the landscape at the moon and everything, and it's just so beautiful. I mean, it's God creation. I was sitting there and thinking to myself, how could anyone see such a beautiful thing and not believe in a creator? If we look at Colossians 1, verses 16 through 18, it says, for by him all things were created, in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible. Whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities, all things were created through him and for him. And he is before all things, and in him all things hold together. And he is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, that in everything he might be preeminent. All these verses are talking about how God created everything. When we see these beautiful things in nature, we see the beauty of God's creation. If we see God's creation, we see his plan. There are reasons why God created everything. If God hadn't created everything, then how would his plan of Jesus coming to this earth to die on the cross for us to salvation and a chance to be with him in heaven one day? Can you see God's beauty? If you're here tonight and you need prayers at church, or you're not a Christian and you need to be baptized, you can come forward as we stand and sing.
There is an endless song echoes in my soul. I hear the music ring, and though the storms may come, I am holding on, and to the rock I cling. How can I keep from singing your praise? How can I ever sing? How amazing is your love? How can I keep from shouting your name? I know I am loved by the King, and it makes my heart want to sing. I will lift my eyes in the darkest night, for I know my Savior lives, and I will walk with you, knowing you'll see me through, and sing the songs you give. How can I keep on singing your praise? How can I ever say enough? How amazing is your love? How can I keep from shouting your name? I know I am loved by the King, and it makes my heart. How can I keep up singing your praise. How can I ever say enough? How amazing is your love? How can I keep shouting your name? I know I am loved by the King, and it makes my heart. I am loved by the King, and it makes my heart want to sing. The closing song will be led by Tyler Ferguson, one of our young men here at the congregation. Before we let him lead this song, I do want to say how much I am grateful for Cameron to do the devotional tonight. He was supposed to do it last week and he didn't, and I think he did a pretty good job. So give him some encouragement if you can. He's our youth intern this summer. For those of you who are watching by YouTube, and so anyway, for those here in the audience, after the closing prayer, which I believe is being led by Braden, correct? Braden is going to be leading our closing prayer. Ricky is closing us out in a word of prayer. Never mind. One of the elders is Ricky Brockville. Once he leads the closing prayer, there will be some announcements that are going to be made after the live stream is over. So if you can, just bear with us. We've got several we've got to make tonight. So please bear with us. We want to thank you for those watching by live stream. We want to thank you for tuning in this evening, I guess is what you can call it. It's still light out, so it's evening or afternoon. I don't know. Anyway, may God give you peace. May God give you blessings. And Tyler, take it away.
Page 842. A